There is a burden you are carrying right now. Maybe you've been carrying it for months, maybe for years, and you don't know if God gave it to you or if you picked it up yourself and have been calling it a calling ever since. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because a burden God gave you will stretch you, yes. It will cost you, yes. But underneath the weight of it, there will be something that sustains you. A strange strength that shows up when you should have collapsed. A clarity that doesn't make sense given how hard things are. A sense even when you're exhausted that this is where you're supposed to be. But a burden you're carrying alone, that one feels different. It doesn't stretch you. It crushes you. It doesn't clarify. It confuses. And no matter how much you pray, no matter how much you push, the weight never lifts because it was never meant to be yours in the first place. The Bible gives us very clear markers for both. And once you see them, you'll be able to look at what you're carrying right now and know the difference. Before we go through the markers, I need to establish something that will reshape how you read everything that follows. In Matthew 11:28, 3:0, Jesus said, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." Now read that carefully, because it does not say, "I will remove every burden." It says, "My burden is light." That means there is a burden. Jesus is not promising a burden-free life. He's promising a specific kind of burden, one that comes with rest for your soul built into the carrying of it. The yoke Jesus is describing is not weightless. A yoke is a farming tool designed so that two oxen share the load together. One carries the burden alone, one carries it with help. Jesus is saying, when I give you a burden, I carry it with you. The weight is real, but you are not the only one pulling. And here is the principle that changes everything. A burden God gave you will always feel lighter than the actual weight of it. Not because it's easy, but because you are not carrying it alone. A burden you picked up yourself or that someone else placed on you will always feel heavier than it should, because you're the only one pulling. That is the core diagnostic. Keep it in mind as we go through the markers. The first marker is about origin. And the clearest way to see it is through two men who carried two very different kinds of burdens about the same broken city. Nehemiah chapter 1. He was a cupbearer in the Persian palace, a comfortable position, safe, prestigious. And one day his brother came from Jerusalem with news. The walls were broken down. The gates had been burned. The people who had returned from exile were in great trouble and disgrace. Read what Nehemiah did next. Verse 4. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. He didn't call a meeting. He didn't draft a plan. He sat down and wept. For days, he mourned for a broken city he didn't even live in. A wall that had been destroyed over 140 years before he was born. He had no personal stake in it. He was comfortable in Persia. He could have shaken his head, said what a shame, and gone back to work, but he couldn't. The grief wouldn't leave him. For 4 months, from the month of Chislev to the month of Nisan, he fasted and prayed before he ever said a word to the king. The burden came to him. He did not go looking for it, and it would not let him go. Now contrast that with a different kind of religious burden, the kind the Pharisees carried. They had constructed for themselves an elaborate system of 613 commandments, and they carried the burden of enforcing those rules with tremendous zeal. They genuinely believed they were doing God's work. But Jesus said of them in Matthew 23, "They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger." The Pharisees were exhausted. They were also exhausting everyone around them, and they had confused religious obligation with divine burden. The two are not the same. The diagnostic question for this marker is this: did you choose this burden, or did it choose you? Did you pick it up because it seemed like the right thing to do, because someone else needed help, because it was expected of you, because you felt guilty if you didn't, or did it land on you in a way you didn't ask for and cannot shake, no matter how hard you try? A burden God gave you almost always has the quality of Nehemiah's grief. It arrived, it refused to leave. It drove you to prayer before it drove you to action. A burden you're carrying alone almost always has the quality of the Pharisees' system. You constructed it. It made sense at the time, but somewhere along the way, it stopped connecting you to God and started exhausting you instead. The second marker is about what happens inside you when you carry it. Jeremiah is the most extreme case in the entire Old Testament. He is called the weeping prophet, and that title undersells it. He was mocked, imprisoned, thrown into a cistern, and told by God at the very beginning of his calling that no one would listen to him. That is what God told him up front. I'm sending you to preach, and they won't hear you. For over 40 years. And there is a verse in Jeremiah chapter 20 that might be the most honest sentence any prophet ever wrote. Jeremiah had been beaten by the chief officer of the temple, put in stocks overnight, and publicly humiliated. And in that moment, he tried to quit. He says in verse 9, "If I say, I will not mention him or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot." Read that again. He was weary. He wanted to stop. He tried to stop. He decided to stop. And he could not. That is not the language of a man who enjoys his work. That is the language of a man who carries a burden so embedded in his identity that even when he tries to lay it down, it won't let him go. The fire was shut up in his bones. He could no more stop being a prophet than he could stop being Jeremiah. That is one of the clearest signs of a God-given burden. It persists even when you try to put it down, even when you're exhausted, even when nobody is listening, even when the cost has become more than you bargained for. You can't quit, not because you're too proud to quit, but because the thing itself won't release you. Now contrast that with what a self-imposed burden produces. It produces performance, and performance has a very specific feeling that is different from calling. Performance is always watching the audience. It needs the response of other people to feel justified. It requires visible results to feel worthwhile. It generates anxiety when recognition doesn't come, and over time it generates resentment toward the people who don't appreciate the sacrifice, toward the situation that keeps demanding more, toward God for not making it easier. That resentment is a diagnostic marker. Not because feeling frustrated in your calling is wrong. Jeremiah felt frustrated. Elijah felt frustrated. Moses felt frustrated. But there is a specific kind of bitterness that grows in the person carrying a self-imposed burden. It has a particular flavor that says, I am giving and I am getting nothing back. And underneath that bitterness is a transaction that was never supposed to be there, a burden that is really a bargain. I'll do this, and God will reward me, and people will recognize me, and things will go the way I want. When the transaction doesn't pay out, the resentment surfaces. A burden God gave you doesn't feel like a transaction. It feels like a compulsion, like fire in your bones. You don't carry it because of what you'll get. You carry it because you genuinely cannot put it down. The third marker is the one I think is most important and the most neglected. Go back to Elijah. 1 Kings chapter 18. He calls down fire from heaven in one of the greatest miracles in the entire Old Testament. 450 prophets of Baal defeated, the drought broken, the rain comes. By any measurement, it is the greatest day of his ministry. And then Jezebel sends him a message. She will kill him by tomorrow. And Elijah runs. He travels a day into the wilderness, sits down under a broom tree, and says, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. I have had enough." The man who just called down fire from heaven wanted to die. Now watch very carefully what God does, because this is where the distinction becomes most clear. God does not give Elijah a new vision. He does not rebuke him for his fear. He does not remind him of the miracle he just performed. He does not say, "Pull yourself together, there's work to do." An angel touches him and says, "Get up and eat. There is bread baked on hot coals and a jar of water." Elijah eats. He lies down again. The angel comes back a second time, touches him again, says, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too great for you." 2 meals, 2 naps, before God said a single word about the mission. That phrase, "the journey is too great for you," is one of the most tender lines in all of Scripture. God is not saying you're weak. He's saying, "I see how much this has cost you, and I'm taking care of you before I ask anything more." He ministers to the physical body before he addresses the spiritual calling. Here is what this reveals. When a burden is genuinely from God, he takes responsibility for sustaining the person who carries it. He doesn't ask you to find your own sustenance and then come back and serve. He feeds you first. He gives you rest. And then, in the strength of that provision, the journey becomes possible. A burden God gave you is always accompanied by his provision for the person carrying it. Not always comfort, not always ease, but provision, something that keeps you upright when the weight should have taken you down. A burden you're carrying alone has no such provision, because the one who assigns the burden is also the one responsible for sustaining the carrier, and if God didn't assign it, that provision isn't attached to it. You're supplying the strength yourself, and eventually you run out. The diagnostic question here is not, "Am I tired?" Elijah was exhausted after his greatest victory. Tiredness is not the marker. The question is, when I am at my lowest, is there something that sustains me that I cannot explain on my own terms? Is there a grace that shows up precisely when I should have collapsed? If yes, the burden is likely from God. If no, if you are running purely on willpower, on obligation, on pride, on the fear of what happens if you stop the burden, may be yours alone. The 4th marker moves outward. A burden God gave you produces something in the world around you that you could not have manufactured by yourself. It bears fruit disproportionate to your effort. Nehemiah's burden led him to ask the Persian king for permission to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. He was a cupbearer. This was not his jurisdiction, not his expertise, not his role. And the king not only said yes, he gave Nehemiah letters of safe passage, supplied the timber, and sent army officers and cavalry with him. The king of Persia funded the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls because a cupbearer wept about it. That is disproportionate fruit. Nehemiah did not engineer that outcome. He prayed for 4 months and then showed up sad at work one day. The rest was God moving on the heart of a pagan king. This is the pattern. When a burden is from God, he opens doors and moves resources that you could not have moved yourself. The fruit doesn't make sense given your natural influence or ability. You look back and realize you did far less than you thought you did because someone else was working alongside you. Now, here is the nuance that I don't want you to miss. Disproportionate fruit does not mean immediate fruit. Nehemiah built the wall in 52 days. That sounds fast until you read the actual process. Constant opposition, threats, workers who were exhausted and afraid. Half of them working with one hand and holding a weapon in the other. There was nothing easy about it. The fruit was disproportionate but not painless. And Jeremiah preached for over 40 years without seeing a single recorded conversion in the text of his book. His fruit was not visible in his lifetime, but his words outlasted every king he prophesied to, every empire that surrounded him, every person who mocked him. His fruit was simply delayed. So the question is not whether the results are immediate or dramatic. The question is whether what you're doing is producing things beyond your natural capacity, and whether, when you look honestly at the outcomes, God's fingerprints are more visible than yours. Before I give you the diagnostic and close, I need to say something important. Some people will use this framework as permission to put down every burden that feels hard. And that would be a misreading. Every God-given burden feels heavy. Nehemiah wept for days. Jeremiah wanted to quit. Elijah wanted to die. The weight of a divine calling is real, and there will be seasons where it feels absolutely crushing. That experience does not mean the burden isn't from God. The markers I've described are not about comfort. They're about source and sustenance. The burden may be heavy. The question is whether something underneath the weight is holding you up. There is also this. Sometimes a burden that started as God-given becomes self-imposed over time, because we stop bringing it back to Him, because we start carrying it in our own strength out of habit, out of pride, or because we stopped asking whether He is still in it. If a burden that once felt like a calling now feels only like exhaustion, it may not mean the calling has ended. It may mean you need to do what Elijah did: eat, rest, and let God speak before you move again. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes the right response to a burden is to put it down. Not every burden that lands on you is meant to stay. Some are meant to be handed to someone else. Some are meant to be laid at God's feet. The wisdom to know the difference is itself a gift worth praying for. So let me give you the 4 questions directly. First, did this burden choose you, or did you choose it? Did it arrive uninvited and refuse to leave, like Nehemiah's grief? Or did you pick it up because it seemed like the responsible thing to do? Second, when you try to put it down, what happens? Does it release, or does it come back? Is there something like fire in your bones that makes it impossible to actually walk away, or do you put it down and feel mostly relief? Third, is there something sustaining you in the carrying of it that you cannot explain by your own strength? Not comfort, not ease, but provision. Something that keeps you upright when the math doesn't add up. Fourth, when you look at what the burden has produced in others, in the world, in your own character, do you see fruit that is disproportionate to what you could have generated alone? Or does the fruit match exactly what you would expect from human effort and willpower? You don't have to answer all 4 perfectly. These are signposts, not a checklist. But if you sit with them honestly, they will tell you something true. After Elijah ate the second meal, after he rested twice, and the angel had said to him, "The journey is too great for you," he got up and walked 40 days and 40 nights to the mountain of God, in the strength of that food. That is the phrase Scripture uses. Not in the strength of his willpower, not in the strength of his calling or his past victories, in the strength of what God provided when he was at his lowest. He arrived at a cave, and God came to him not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, in a still, small voice, a gentle whisper, and asked him the question that cuts to the heart of everything. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Not accusatory, not impatient, just, "Where are you, and how did you get here?" That is the question worth sitting with. Not, "Am I carrying too much?" Not, "Is my burden real?" But, "How did I get here? Who gave me this? And is the one who gave it still walking with me in it?" If you can answer yes, if somewhere underneath the weight you can feel the yoke that is shared rather than the one you're pulling alone, then keep going. Not in your own strength, in the strength of what He provides. The journey may be long, but you were not meant to walk it alone.